how many generations get to actually affect the future of their entire
Yes.
species by what they do? And for me, that is incredibly
Yeah.
exciting. It's like, why would that not be the most interesting time to be alive?
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't mean it's the safest by any
No.
means, but at the same time, it's like, wow, I can do something that actually will make a difference because actually we're at one of those
Yes.
points in history where it
Yes. For
can.
every JoJo, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you this happy summer afternoon?
I'm actually very well, thank you. And I am coming in from the Cotswolds. I'm in a little market town called Stroud in the west of England.
Oh, Stroud. Stroud is magical. It's kind of like Totnes, isn't it? It's got that sort of switched on peopleness to it.
It definitely has. I think there may be something in the water around here. I mean, Stop Ecocide started here, Extinction Rebellion started here,
Yeah.
Global Citizens Assembly started here.
Wow.
So
And Ros Savage, I believe, lives there, and she just got to be the MP of North Cotswolds. Having this time
she
last
has
year, she
indeed.
didn't
Yes,
even
she's
want
just
to be
won a
an
seat.
MP. It's like in less than 6 months, she was the candidate and then elected. It was amazing. So there you go. Stroud is actually magical. So yes, all these things started here, and you are the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. So tell us a little bit about the founding, because you and Polly Higgins started it together. How and why did you do that?
Wow. Well, I mean, firstly, to absolutely encapsulate what it is we do, we're an international advocacy organization with one very specific goal, which is the criminalization of the worst harms to nature, or ecocide. And this is a concept that was resurrected by Polly, who dedicated the last 10 years of her life to bringing it, back into prominence. She sadly died in 2019 of a very rapid cancer. Um, but I suppose in a way, I'm going to start with her and then how I kind of ended up joining that stream, if you like. So, I mean, she was actually quite a successful barrister, and was just sort of hitting what you might call the big time when she had this kind of epiphany. And she asked herself this one question: how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And that was to direct the rest of her life. And she looked down a number of avenues, including rights of nature, which is now quite a large movement internationally. But she came to the criminal law side when she discovered that during the drafting of a code that was being worked on by the International Law Commission in the 90s, that was kind of like a precursor to the Rome Statute. Now, the Rome Statute is the governing document of the International Criminal Court. And when she was looking into this sort of drafting process that was happening back in the 90s, what she discovered was that there was originally a clause in that draft that would have addressed severe, widespread, and long term harm to the environment. Now, that clause never made the Rome Statute, it never made that final treaty. And I think that she honestly, I mean, her reaction was almost like, well, what world would we have been in today if the International Criminal Court had not just addressed war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, but also ecocide? And so I think she spent the last few, sort of 10 years of her life dedicated to what she saw as replacing the missing international crime, and that was ecocide. And I met Polly in 2014. And by that time, I had already spent maybe a year or so diving into, um, I suppose, environmental campaigning and activism as a result of my discovery of fracking or hydraulic fracturing, which is this incredibly polluting way of bringing oil and gas up from deep under the earth. And I remember reading about it and just thinking there is absolutely no angle from which this makes sense. Not economic. It's not, obviously not ecological, in terms of health, in terms of, I mean, there was no way that it seemed to work. And I just couldn't understand it. And it was almost, I think most activists or people who've sort of been in that space have had a moment of kind of wake up or outrage. And for me, that was mine. And I remember talking about it to my friends and family. And my little daughter was just 5 at the time, and she burst into tears and she said, "Mummy, if they're poisoning the ground, they're going to poison themselves. They're going to die. You have to call them and tell them to stop." And I
Oh,
can't
the joy of youth.
and I just thought, well, a 5-year-old
Yeah,
understands
yeah.
this. Surely this should be obvious to everyone. So that was, I suppose, the moment that started to kind of move me in this direction.
Wow, I'd love to go down the fracking route. Actually, let's go down the fracking route because it's as someone who knows relatively little, the thing that really blows all my fuses is the idea that they are poisoning the groundwater forever. For the rest of the existence of this planet, the groundwater is now poisoned with stuff that they won't tell us what's in it because it's a commercial secret. And that
That's right.
just, I just cannot believe human beings who will do this. But you're saying it's not even commercially viable. One of my students is a very powerful activist who's been around since Greenham days, and once in a while puts on a business suit, looks very smart. And she went into one of their meetings and she said all along the walls are big posters saying the size of the prize. And she hung around with these people looking like one of them, and all they were talking about was the potential for making huge amounts of money at some point. And they literally don't care about anything else. But if I just heard you right, you're saying it doesn't even make sense commercially.
No, because I mean, they need in order to actually make a field productive, you've got to create. You've got to basically put sort of thousands of these wells, which obviously destroys entire swathes of countryside.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and one of the things in the UK was they were trying to make out somehow it was just a little well here and there in the countryside. And of course, actually, when you looked at the pictures from say Queensland, Australia, where you could see
Yeah, it
what
looks like a
actually
pincushion.
the land, yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, it was absolutely insane. But also, the whole kind of ways that it was set up were kind of almost what you might think of as kind of Ponzi schemes, in the sense that you're sort of selling an investment, but then ultimately the productivity is never very high.
Right.
And so and also, I mean, the actual track record of the wells was terrible. I mean, something like over a fairly short number of years, there was some huge percentage, like sort of 50 or 60% that would ultimately end up leaking. And
And
you
they're
just
leaking methane,
it
which is a
yeah,
fantastically potent
exactly.
greenhouse gas. Right.
Exactly. So you can imagine. I mean, anyway. So this really sort of drove me into this, sort of onto my feet, I suppose,
Right.
out of my activist
Because
armchair
you
where
had
I
been
was
working for
kind of
38 degrees, if I've understood your CV correctly.
yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, obviously it was voluntary, but I started the local 38 degrees group here in Stroud in the UK. 38 degrees is, I suppose, a bit like the sort of UK Avars or something like that, or sort of WeMove. And so yes, I've been involved in that, but the fracking in particular had got me actually properly researching, writing leaflets, giving talks, organizing demonstrations, all of that. And I met Polly because she moved to our area, and also she was at the time researching some stuff around fracking for a potential case. And some mutual friends put us in touch, and they said, "Look, you've got to talk to JoJo because she knows all about this. She's been doing loads of research and everything." So that's how we originally sort of got talking to each other, I guess. Um, and it was one of those kindred spirit moments. I mean, I had come across her in the past. I'd heard about what she was doing. And I remember thinking, well, yes, call it ecocide and make it a crime. That sounds incredibly sensible. But when we met, it was very much a kindred spirit moment. I mean, about after about half an hour with each other, we were pretty much sitting there saying, well, we're obviously working together then. And there was something about, I mean, we had what we should have shared was this incredibly kind of pragmatic, common sense approach. Um, I sometimes think of it as a sort of ready, steady, cook type approach. So you kind of know that you want to end up with something specific. I mean, obviously, with ready, steady, cook, it's a beautiful dish. In our case, it was an international crime, but effectively, you know where where it's up, and you don't know exactly how you're going to get there, but the range of ingredients in front of you, and the response is,
Yeah.
well, what can I creatively do with these ingredients to sort of get me where I'm going? And I suppose it's a slightly kind of maverick improvisational approach, um, but also a very grounded one. What do we actually have? What can we actually do? Um, and I think that that particular that partnership, what became a very close friendship, actually was very much in that spirit, I suppose.
And did you have a legal background?
Personally, no.
Okay.
My background was well, it was quite meandering actually in terms of I didn't have a career path as such, but there was a sort of I suppose a thread that ran through all of that, which was probably communication.
Okay.
I mean, I actually worked in travel in my 20s, in manufacturing in my 30s. I used to run a manufacturing company, if you can believe that. And then I got into design and web design and graphics and all of those kinds of things. And I ended up, working with Polly through the environmental campaigning side,
Right.
which I'd obviously taken up not so much as as work, but as a sort of passion project, I suppose. But I mean, obviously, I worked with Polly until she died, which was sort of 4.5 to 5 years from then. And by that point, I was probably one of the best informed people on the
Oh,
planet about
quite.
this
Yes.
particular
Yes.
area.
You know how
Um,
laws are formed by then. You know the structure and the wording and also how people have made them happen. Sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
No, no, not at all. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I would definitely, I mean, obviously I wasn't a trained lawyer, but obviously I knew this area very well. And I think as well at the same time, what we kind of brought to the party together, if you like, was this combination of the campaigning spirit, which is obviously the direction I came from, and the legal side, which is where Polly came from. And we actually originally co-founded what is now Stop Ecocide International in 2017, partly in response to the fact that it was actually difficult for Polly to find funding for the
Right.
work that she was pioneering, particularly, and we needed more funds to move forward the diplomatic conversation, which was just beginning at that point. And so it was a sort of response to that where we, the bigger foundations and so on just found it too extreme. They found it too radical. And so what we did was we kind of converted. I know it's crazy, isn't it, when you think about it? Because there's nothing less radical than just
Well,
saying let's not destroy the planet. I mean,
yes.
it's actually yeah, there's nothing particularly outrageous about that. But what we did eventually was to convert Polly's following into the beginnings of a membership,
Right.
and effectively almost crowdfund that way, if you like. And so that's how the campaign was born. And that enabled some of the first trips that Polly did to The Hague, to the Assembly of States Parties, to the International Criminal Court, and so on, were financed that way.
Right. So, taking a step back, you said earlier that we wanted to add a fourth crime, that the International Criminal Court, if I got it down right, there are war crimes as one thing, genocide as another thing,
Mhm.
and crimes against humanity as a third thing. And they decided not to have crimes against the natural world when they were originally setting those up. Do we know, first of all, why not? I mean, because war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity seem a bunch of overlapping things. But then, if you were to add
Mhm.
in and destroying the entire ecosphere, which is the thing that underpins all life, it's an
Yes.
obvious envelope in which all of those exist. Was there a huge amount of lobbying from, say, fossil fuel companies or just generally big companies to get it taken away, or did they all just think it didn't really matter?
No, I don't think the latter was true. There were, I mean, from the research that Polly did along with some academic colleagues, it seems that there wasn't a specific moment when it was voted out. It sort of got quietly dropped from what we can see, and but there were there were several countries that weighed in against it at
Would I
different
guess the
points.
US and the UK?
Oh yes, the US, the UK, also France and the Netherlands, and at one
The
point briefly
Netherlands?
Brazil.
I thought they
Yeah.
were the good
Well, I think
guys.
well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually all of those countries are oil countries.
Okay.
They're all oil countries. And certainly with those main four, US, UK, France, and Netherlands, at the time they were either already testing or considering testing nuclear weapons. So I mean, obviously, making a nuclear weapon may or may not be ecocidal, but using one almost certainly is.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
so I don't know how it can be anything else,
No,
really.
no, right. Yes.
So that could have had something to do with it. We can't guarantee it. We don't know for sure. But
Okay.
but it's interesting to to sort of draw those, join some of those dots and just speculate. But certainly,
For
I mean,
sure.
those three crimes that came in that were sort of covered by the statute when the court first opened its doors in 2002. I mean, if we think about, I mean, you're absolutely right. Ecocide ultimately underpins all of them because without a livable planet, I mean, we can't even
The
consider,
rest are just noise.
yes,
It's
exactly.
total genocide.
Exactly. And in fact, there was another crime that was added later, the crime of aggression. So there are actually now four, although not everybody's ratified the fourth.
Has
So now,
everybody ratified the others? Because it seems to me that part of what was happening, the chaos in the Middle East is that Israel either doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court or doesn't care what it says, which is then also an issue.
well, yeah, indeed. And certainly at the moment, the discussion around international law is quite live in a way that it possibly hasn't ever been before precisely because of this. And of course, the court has had to do the even-handed thing, which is in line, obviously, with international law, and request arrest warrants all round, if you
Mm,
like. But those, but they have been controversial, and it, there are all kinds of discussions going on at the diplomatic level, and around those issues. What we do as an organization is do our absolute best to steer clear of those discussions,
okay,
because we believe that the ecocide issue is so fundamental that it shouldn't depend on any other context.
right.
And in the same vein, today, this year, as you know, is an big election year around the world. And what we've made, efforts to do is actually try and keep ecocide out of that conversation.
Right.
Because
You
what we
don't want
don't
it to be assigned to
Yes,
one or other side of a
exactly.
guaranteed bipolar situation. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't want it to become a partisan issue. And we keep very precise about, and sometimes, in panels I've been asked, so what's Stop Ecocide's position on, X, Y, whatever. And I will simply say, we don't have a position on that. There's one thing we want, and that is the criminalization of the worst harms to nature. And actually, interestingly, we believe that this has had a big, um, is a big part of how we've managed to, uh, in a sense, sort of work our way through the political and diplomatic conversation to quite a high level, because we are always positive about how we portray things, which is interesting, obviously, given the subject matter. But what we don't do, for example, is point fingers, accuse particular companies or particular states. What we actually underline is the fact that this is an absolutely common sense provision that will help everybody and that we're all going to be in deep water without. And effectively, keep it on, in the sense of, really a legal tool that is of benefit to everyone. In fact, sometimes I think of it as a Swiss Army knife. Whoever you're talking to, there is a tool somewhere there that ecocide law will provide.
Okay. I like the Swiss Army knife metaphor. Let's move into that later. But you've said several times now that we're criminalizing the worst harm to nature. And worst has, to me, an objective scale to it. How do we
Hmm.
decide that something is bad enough to count as being worst and something that's just really
Worse.
not very good but isn't the worst? Where are you setting the dividing lines on that?
This is a really important issue, and it comes down to, how do you define ecocide? And actually, one of the biggest milestones in all of this was the establishment by our charitable foundation in 2020 of an international panel of lawyers to spend 6 months drafting a definition of ecocide that could be, effectively, have the weight and credibility that governments would seriously consider it, to actually propose it at the International Criminal Court. And of course, these issues of thresholds were very much part of those discussions. And I mean, it was actually a remarkable situation because, the term ecocide actually goes back to 1970, where it was originally used to describe damage to the natural environment in Vietnam caused by Agent Orange. But it sort of languished, I suppose, a little bit in a kind of political and legal backwater over the decades since. But there were various attempts to define it. What was different about this one was that, rather than just being a lawyer or a small group of lawyers saying, "Oh, well, we think ecocide should be a crime, we think it should look like this," this actually was the result of a political request. So we were actually approached by Swedish parliamentarians who said to us, "This is obviously your area of expertise. Would you be able to convene a drafting project, and come up with a consensus definition that we can credibly take to our government?" And that enabled us to bring together these top lawyers from around the world, including the very renowned British French barrister Philippe Sands, who is himself an expert on the origins of international crimes. And we were delighted that he accepted to co-chair this panel, along with a remarkable Senegalese jurist who was the first female prosecutor there, Diofal So. And those discussions, took place over 6 months and emerged with a consensus definition. And what was so beautiful about this definition is that, it has a few paragraphs to it, but the core text is only one sentence, and it's so concise that it fits on the back of a business card. And I think this is wonderful. When you're dealing with politicians, they never have time to read through a 20-page report. But the definition they came up with is: ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, that's actually based quite strongly on legal precedent, but at the same time, it's actually very straightforward to understand. Um, of both looking at the severity of harm, so it can't just be chopping down the trees on the village green, got to be severe and either widespread or long term, but also this aspect of unlawful or wanton, where effectively um, it either has to be something that results from a kind of a breach of existing laws, but takes the harm to a certain level, or it has to be something that, even if it's permitted, creates a disproportionate level of harm. Now, this definition emerged in June 2021. And I could put it in a personal way and say that until that time, I was able to read all my emails. After that, things just kind of ramped up because it absolutely triggered political, legal, and academic conversation all around the world. And things have moved incredibly fast since. And I think what it encapsulates is, firstly, as I say, this severity, because to be an international crime, something has to be pretty severe. But you'll notice it also doesn't designate particular amounts. So it also doesn't say, a certain kilometrage or a certain duration. And what the panel realized when they were doing their discussions is that if you did that, you would be effectively preventing a case by case analysis, which would actually be essential in cases like this. So you might have, for example, a chemical disaster, maybe like Bhopal, for example, where actually the damage was fairly localized, but it was absolutely extreme. And you would want that to probably come under ecocide. On the other hand, you could have something that potentially was very widespread, might eventually be, sort of restorable, but it was, be so expansive that it should also be included. So they ended up with this sort of severe and or, in other words, could be widespread or long term. And actually, criminal law, it's not unusual to have these things sort of set in this way. Things like recovery in a reasonable amount of time, or what constitutes severe, because those things are decided on the basis of individual cases. Let's just say, take a simple example. If you're beaten up in the street, it's not the number of bruises that will tell a court whether it was attempted murder or grievous bodily harm or simple assault. It's the whole, it's the ensemble of what happens.
Okay. So we have an established set of concepts that allows courts internationally to balance these things. Because I'm guessing, and this is a pure guess, that assault in the street, if I get a black eye in the street, it might mean different things in different jurisdictions. How, at an international level, do we bring people together to agree that Bhopal is really bad? Or I'm sitting here thinking the fact that you now have polyfluorinated, alkylated substances in the rain is pretty darn widespread. And I heard something the other day on Nate Higgins' podcast that Daniel Schmachtenberger's Consilience project got an earth scientist in, and the total, let me get this right, I think it's 46 or 48 billion is the income per annum of the whole PFAS industry. It would cost 118 trillion per annum, which is more than the GDP of the entire planet, to clean it up. That strikes me that should qualify. That really ought to qualify. Please, can we bring a case? And so, how do lawyers, if I don't know how much you must spend a lot of time talking to lawyers. How do they balance something so that it is genuinely international, and so a harm in any part of the world is considered a harm everywhere, or by lawyers everywhere?
Well, I think what you're dealing with with criminal law is that you do have to be able to point to a specific act that created something. So um, something that happens, cumulatively across an industry is harder to pinpoint. To be fair, what you would be looking at more, what you would be more looking at, I think, in that kind of context, you might be looking at the permit level. So you might be looking at a political decision, for example. So because you need to be able to isolate a particular decision. But I think what's interesting about, this is the whole discussion around criminal law is interesting, because when you say the word crime, even people tend to run off down a dark alley with a knife because that's what they associate with the word crime. What people often sort of don't focus on is the fact that criminal law is there primarily as a protective structure. So, murder is a crime. Yes, we punish murderers and we put them in jail, etc. But really, the point of it is to stop people killing each other. And of course, with ecocide, this is very much the idea that what you would be creating is a level of deterrence, because ultimately, yes, of course, once the law's in place, there will be prosecutions. There's no doubt. There's plenty of lawyers wanting to get their teeth into this. However, that isn't ultimately the point. We're not that interested in throwing people in jail. What we're interested in is protecting the planet. So what we're interested in is changes in behavior. And changes in behavior, when we're looking at systemic interventions that A, the system allows, and B, actually can have a concrete effect in a fairly short amount of time, criminal law is very high on that list, because it has, there's something very different. There's no real moral stigma attached to breaching regulation. And most environmental law is in that regulatory sphere. And that's a
Right.
big cultural thing. We've spent centuries building up an economic system that depends upon our attitude towards nature being one of treating it as a bank of resources
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
treating
And
her
damage to it is an
as the origin of
externality
it.
and we don't care. Yeah.
Exactly. So we tend to treat, and companies do treat damage to nature as externalities, and they don't absorb the costs, they don't consider the consequences. So when you name the worst harms, when you name ecocide as a crime, what you're doing is, on one level, it's quite simple. You're adding a crime to a list of crimes, and the system perfectly well permits that. There are amendment procedures; it can be done. But what you're actually saying is something quite profound. What you're saying is you're shifting our kind of cultural attitude toward nature and our position within nature, and effectively saying, well, destroying ecosystems is as bad, wrong, and dangerous as it is to destroy or damage people. And that starts to really shift our sort of mindset and our sense of what our responsibility is to the living world around us. Not only that, but how much we actually depend upon it as well. So there's a big um, I mean, I could say it's a symbolic function, but it's actually more than a symbolic function because our lives and the future of our civilization actually depend upon it. So even if no prosecutions were ever taken, and I'm sure there will be, but even if they weren't, just placing it in that position at the court that deals with the most severe crimes, you are actually starting to create really quite a profound shift. And we're in quite an interesting position now because, I mean, we've sort of propelled this conversation, I mean, with help, obviously, but we've been at the heart of it. We've propelled this conversation from zero governments talking about it 5 years ago after Polly died to EU legislation, which was passed just this year, and for something very close to what we're asking for at the international level. Now, for international law, that's kind of rocket speed. That's very fast. Um, and so what we're now in this interesting position where the legislative direction is now established, but there still isn't a huge amount of awareness in the public sphere. And so what we now find ourselves in the business of doing is actually informing people, and particularly in the corporate world, where they're really going to need to know this because the whole point is it's coming down the line and they're going to need to look at their practices and how much harm they actually create. It is kind of alerting them to that and saying, look, here, can you see the horizon? That's what's coming. So it's been a very exciting, if somewhat roller coaster ride, actually, because as I say, the EU has just passed a directive which most of the EU countries will have to harmonise with within the next couple of years that actually deals with conduct that they're calling comparable to ecocide,
Wow.
which
Why are
which
they
is the
not
first.
calling it ecocide? That must be deliberate.
Well, it's partly because there's no official international definition yet.
Couldn't they make one?
I mean, there's a proposed one that's kicked off all of these discussions around the world, but there's not a sort of internationally agreed one yet,
Okay.
by states. So they kind of couldn't put it directly into the text,
Okay.
at least not without developing it specifically. So what they did was they put, very similar aspects of the definition, so the severity, the irreversibility, and so on. And then in the preamble, they described it as addressing conduct comparable to ecocide. So what
Okay.
that's done is it's actually really put ecocide on the map in
Yeah.
terms of European law because it's the first time it's been used in that context. So yeah, very
Interesting.
interesting.
And so does this mean that CEOs of the big companies could end up in prison as a result of them? Let's say, I don't know, there's a spill in the North Sea. Let's say the UK somehow miraculously decides to sign up to something that the EU has developed. Um, would potentially people who made decisions within that company end up with long jail terms? Because that seems to me virtually the only thing that's going to have weight. Because if you offer to find them,
Mm.
you'd have to find them probably more than the GDP of the planet before they would notice. Honestly, I mean, they've got so much money and they basically make it out nothing anyway that finding them isn't really going to make much difference. So is this actual, you will languish in a very unpleasant place that you don't want to be in if you break this?
That is a very important aspect, yes. I mean, the fact that individual, physical people as opposed to legal persons like companies, will can are actually potentially, it could lose not just their reputation, but indeed their freedom. Um, and that's so that is definitely something. I mean, for example, if you look at the European legislation, they're talking about sentences of 10 years plus. If you look at the Belgian legislation, because they've actually adopted ecocide at the governmental level just a few months ago, they're looking at sentencing even potentially longer than that. So, yes, it's a very, it's a very real thing. And I think the other thing that's beautiful about that, if you can say beautiful about a sentencing procedure, but beautiful about a law like this, is that you actually have, particularly in the corporate world, a sort of double layer of deterrence. Because if you're a C-suite executive and potentially the buck may stop with you, um, then obviously you're not going to want to have your own freedom of reputation under threat. But the thing is, if you did, it would also affect your company. Because, I mean, if you look at something like war crimes or genocide that are often ideologically motivated, as a genocidal maniac is probably not thinking about their public relations first and foremost. But a company, a transnational company, will be, because particularly if they're publicly listed, which most of them are, effectively, if there's a sort of threat of a criminal accusation, even if a case is not taken forward, that can have a drastic and immediate effect on stock value. So, the level of deterrence is in a whole different league. And it's really important and very a very positive parameter, if you like, to put in. But I think what some people don't always think about is that, and it's quite interesting because lawyers and politicians tend to focus on, how will prosecutions work, who will get prosecuted, what's the sentencing, and not that those things aren't important, of course they are, but actually it's often the corporate actors who really kind of grasp the importance of understanding this law now. Because actually the real value, the real window for strategic change is between when you hear about it and when it comes into play. Because actually, of course, you don't want to be in in the sort of target area for that law when it actually comes into play. So it's really important that that is viewed as a positive, because it's a kind of it's a set of clear parameters. And actually, one of the things that we're confronted with globally at the moment is, it's not like people are not aware of the climate crisis and ecological crisis. A lot of the people, the actors at that level, are not stupid at all. They completely can intellectually understand it. But, either, I mean, obviously in some cases there's just simple levels of corruption. But even where there are not, there are culturally embedded attitudes that mean that those people are not behaving as if they understand it. They may understand, and so once you put those parameters in place, those people who can see that, you know, and often they do want to make some kind of decisions that are more helpful, they can then go say to their board or to their shareholders, we can't do it that way anymore. We're actually going to have to rethink. And that is really fundamentally important, because it actually gives protection for moving in the right direction.
Interesting. So is this beginning to have an impact? Do we have any instances that you are allowed to name where you know that corporate behavior has changed as a result of the potential of this train coming down the line?
We actually do, although I can't give names.
Okay.
But for example, there was a mining company in one of the Latin American countries that was rather reluctant to sign environmental agreements that it was supposed to sign. The lawyer who was dealing with it showed them the definition of ecocide and said, you do realize this is coming down the line, right?
Right.
And they ended up signing. So, so there have been, I mean, that's just one example, but there have been a few instances of things like that already. And what we're also seeing, and it's taken a while, but we're beginning to see the sort of mainstreaming of the conversation now. So, for
Right.
example, just last week we held an event that was geared towards corporate sustainability officers, and who obviously then who have to advise their companies on what's happening with environmental laws, what steps they need to take, and and actually, some of them have been very frustrated with the fact that, they can advise as much as they like, and they don't necessarily get paid a huge amount of attention to. But
Yeah.
once you bring a law like this in, it's a different
Okay.
story, because there's this potential for personal criminal liability. And so again, it's very supportive for those people to know about it, but it's also very important for those people to know about it, because, it, uh, in a way, I mean, it's like earlier when I was saying about how radical it was, it was seen as being, you know, this is not a radical proposition. This is a very straightforward protect everybody proposition. It's basically a safety
Well,
proposition.
quite. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so, and it should be treated as such. I mean, sometimes we actually think of it as almost a criminal version of a health and safety law. I mean, the way people have treated environmental laws up till now has been, it's almost like companies attempted to game the system a bit and kind of go, oh, well, we're allowed this much of this toxin in this context, and that sort of thing. Or even to sort of, balance off profits against, court cases in terms of fines and things like that. Or just try to say that they're not in the category that they thought they were in. So, for example, I don't know if you remember back in 2015, to go back to the fracking thing, the Infrastructure Act in the UK reconstituted the definition of what fracking was. It basically so that companies could say that they weren't fracking when in fact they were. And that sort of thing. Now, of course, when you bring in a definition like this one of ecocide, which doesn't depend on a particular activity, but depends on the potential level of harm, you actually have a kind of reality check. It means that the operational experts, the risk managers, the legal counsels in those companies are actually having to have conversations. And instead of trying to sort of, jump out of a category, they're actually having to go, well, what is happening on the ground? And what do we need to do about it? And the thing about that, which is brilliant, is what it triggers is a lot of very specific questions. And those specific questions, like, for example, how are we going to source or replace our concrete? How are we going to approach this or that engineering problem? These are things that should be being asked and quite possibly should have been being asked decades ago. But nothing has actually constrained them to be asked until now. And of course, when you start asking the right questions, you start finding answers. I mean, this is one of the beauties of the way the human mind works. If you are, once you ask a question, you are preempting the fact that you will at some point find an answer. And so, if there's one thing that this does, these set of parameters, it is prompt the right questions. And having come from, as I say, this rather meandering background and actually spent several years as an entrepreneur myself, I know that there is nothing more stimulating to innovation, and problem solving than a
Right.
clear set of
Right.
parameters.
Right. Yes, because a problem by nature has a solution, as opposed to
Exactly.
a predicament, which is just a wicked problem where there are possibly no solutions. So I'm
Yeah,
thinking, so I'm
exactly.
thinking particularly of the PFAS, where faced with any kind of regulation, they just redesign the molecule so it's one atom different. Then they go, see, we're not regulated anymore, um, which just turns my blood into lava, really. Um, but then this is a different way of looking at it. So then we
Mm.
have an international law, and unless a miracle happens in November and we have a completely different kind of American administration, the chances of them signing up to this are vanishingly small. They never do, because they have too much. They have the best democracy money can buy. The people with the money don't want to be constrained. How do we
Mhm.
get around the fact that an international court can say, we hold you culpable, and this is these are the penalties, and they go, you and whose army, mate? Which is the American
Yeah.
attitude, frankly, and nobody has an army big enough currently. So how are we assuming that reputational damage will be enough, and that it won't just turn it into a badge of pride?
I think this is a really good question because some of the biggest countries and indeed the biggest, potentially therefore the biggest polluters. I mean, that's China, America, Russia, India. They're not actually members of the International Criminal
Mm.
Court, so they're not signed up to it. And in fact, the US still doesn't recognize the Genocide Convention. So um, we do that. Yeah, that is definitely an issue. However, it's also a double edged one in the sense that obviously, if you're not in the voting
Okay, you can't
population,
influence the way that
you
it
can't
frames things.
influence, I mean, obviously that you can certainly try, and I have no doubt that potentially happens. But what you don't have is a vote.
Right.
And that is actually quite useful. And the way that the International Criminal Court works is that it's a one state, one vote situation, like the UN. But unlike the UN, there's no veto, and there's
Right.
no kind of permanent Security Council members or anything
Right.
like that.
Right.
It's literally just a
So
numbers
is
game.
actually weighted.
Um,
Right.
yeah, and what that means, of course, is that the smaller states or the small island states, and we work very closely with the Pacific Island state of Vanuatu, for example, which has really championed this over the last few years. They have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain by this moving forward, and they're able to be first movers in that context. And there are also quite a lot of them. So, and we're also now finding, I mean, we now have regional coordinators in Africa, in Latin America, and there's a lot of interest in some of those countries. And a lot of those groups, either vote together or have a lot of internal communication when dealing with these, sort of amendment issues or treaty issues. So there are a number of reasons, why actually the ICC route is better than most. Um, at the same time, I think there is also the aspect that any ratifying country could take a prosecution. So, and of course, because of the globalized nature of the economy, you might have, I mean, let's just say you have an American company committing ecocide in a country that has ratified the the amendment. They could prosecute in that country. Um, and you've also potentially got a situation where if a company has I know an operational office in a country that is a member state, depending on how that country deals with things like universal jurisdiction, that could also be a possibility. In other words, from the lawyer's perspective, there are a number of different possible avenues. But I think the other thing is, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I mean, in fact, I'm
No,
optimistic by
not
nature
at
because
all.
I don't genuinely believe that you can make something happen if you don't believe it's possible.
Right.
I mean, I just
Yes.
like, you're
Yes. And I
cutting
wasn't
yourself
suggesting it
beneath.
wasn't. I was just beginning to see that there
But
might be ramifications down the line.
yeah, no, there are, of course, ramifications. You're absolutely right. But what I would say as well is that what comes in here, and I think this is something that we have worked on very concretely, is the civil society conversation.
Right.
Because ultimately, when it comes to international law, it is public opinion ultimately that holds that, in place, really. Um, and actually, there's an awful lot of sympathy in the public arena for this law. In fact, one of the very common responses is, "Oh, what you mean? It isn't a crime already?"
Right.
And so because it feels so intuitive. So we kind of know from public surveys that there is a strong appetite for it. And also the other thing that's interesting, I mean, we actually do have an advocacy group in the US. And one of the things about the US is that you could say they have the loudest voices.
Hmm.
In the sense that on the world stage,
Yeah.
US influencers can be very powerful. And so, we're pretty certain it's just a matter of time, before, various very, sort of well-known voices are speaking up about
Okay.
about ecocide, amongst other things.
You
So,
mean well-known
um,
voices in the US?
in the
Okay.
US, yes.
Brilliant. That would be good.
And that I think is the direction that we're heading in. But at the same time, I would also again refer back to the globalized nature of our economy, and the fact that these big corporations that are the ones most likely to need to pay attention to this law operate in many countries. And so, what potentially happens is that over time, you get a marginalization of those corporations that don't align themselves, because their sort of sphere of operation is gradually shrunk until effectively you get. I mean, ultimately, you would get the situation where I don't know, an American company could pollute its own backyard but nowhere else. I mean, obviously, we're a little way away from that. But and once the law is in place, and actually, I mean, we're already starting to see the shift now. As the conversation grows. But I think once the law is in place, this will actually be a real game changer in terms of a kind of, well, you might call it an entrainment factor. I mean, I sometimes do this thing where I pick up a pen like this, and if you imagine this moving through water,
Mhm.
because it's very narrow at the front end, this whole concept of ecocide, if you like, is very, very precise. So it
Right.
doesn't really
It's
create
more
a huge
like a
amount of resistance.
knife moving through the water, isn't it?
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. But behind
Yeah.
it, you get a
Yeah.
wake. And so, in effect, what you're actually doing is drawing,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. You're drawing kind of ripples in the whole
Yes.
system.
Yes. Nice.
And that I think, over time will be very difficult to avoid.
Brilliant. So I have on my pad TTIP, as in Transatlantic Trade and Industry Protocol, because that's one of the most invidious legal constructs on the planet. It basically means that a big company can sue a country not just for stopping it making money, but for stopping the potential that it thought it had to make money. And given that most of the ecocidal things also tend to be quite lucrative, which is why they do them, I'm
Hmm.
wondering, is this going to be the shield that countries can use against TTIP? Because TTIP is one of those, there's three judges that are picked by the company and they meet in secret to decide how much the country should then pay to the company.
It's
It's
the sort of investor
total.
investor state
Yes,
dispute
yes,
settlement
exactly. Yes, the
arrangement.
ISTS.
Yeah, I mean, like the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, but actually some countries are now backing out of that, which is interesting.
Right.
Yes, I actually think ecocide law will be very, very interesting in this context because criminal law does trump trading agreements. Sorry, I was
Let's not
you
use
cut
that
you off
word.
the
It
does.
does
It's only,
override
but
trading agreements.
it is, right. Because, I mean, it doesn't matter what, what other treaties you sign. If you're murdering lots of people to fulfill it, you're still, you still can't do that.
Oh,
So
I don't know. I'm watching
effectively,
the Middle Eastern Sea. I'm not sure.
okay,
Technically,
at least legally speaking, you
yes,
still can't do.
yes.
So yes, I think is the answer to that. It will create a tool that, for an area that has been very, very tricky in recent years. So
That would
yeah,
be amazing.
uh, very important.
That would be a game changer, actually.
Yeah, very
If
much so.
this came into effect and the whole TTIP ISDS thing was then shut down, that would be extraordinary. This feels like Joanna Macy speaks of three pillars of the great turning, and there's the holding actions and the systemic change and the shifting consciousness. And this is a big
Mm,
holding action. It's not
mm,
necessarily changing the system, but it's putting the brakes on the system that is hurtling us
yeah,
to the edge of the cliff. You
yeah.
spoke earlier about a metaphor of a Swiss Army knife. Do you want to unpick that a bit more? Because that really intrigues me. What are the I've got a bottle opener and a screwdriver, and I've got something that actually cuts. I've got a pair of scissors. What are they all? How do they work?
That's really interesting. I actually haven't gone quite as far as to actually identify them one by one, but the metaphor I use is that one because we have we have many different allies and many different audiences in this conversation. And what we find is that ecocide law, in a sense, represents something different in each case. So some of them we've looked at just in this conversation I've been having with you. So, if, for example, for sustainability leaders in business, it's a playing field leveler. For those who are in the extractive industry, it's a clear set of parameters in order to ask specific questions. You could then look at some very different players. For example, for Indigenous land defenders, for example, it's an additional legal tool to help hold to account those who are potentially destroying their lives and livelihoods. It is also a complete narrative changer. In other words, at the moment, protesters and land defenders are often being criminalized and, portrayed as, criminally interrupting legitimate business activity. But as soon as you put something like ecocide law on the table and the question mark then moves from over the protesters to over the business itself. So you're going, well, is this activity actually ecocidal? And at that point, even before you've taken any cases, you've totally changed the narrative. Because at that point, those defenders become moral upholders of the law
Right. It
rather
becomes a
than criminal
citizen's
defenders.
arrest rather than assault.
Exactly. Well,
So
kind of, yeah. But effectively, in the it's the way you think about it. So the framing is literally flipped. So there are all these different,
yeah,
different aspects to this
yes,
law that I have yet to come across an area where it
yeah,
isn't helpful.
yeah,
I mean, other than the very pure make money however you possibly can avenue. But of course, this is the insane thing is that actually there is no reason whatsoever that you can't build a good business model around, a framework that actually protects the
sure.
planet. It's just you won't be poked to do so until that thing's in place.
Yes, the giant vampire squid just needs to get a bit smaller. But we've got people like River Simple. We spoke to them about a year ago, and they build hydrogen fuel cell cars, which is lovely. But the really exciting thing is their global guardian governance model, which gives the shareholders one place on a board that also gives one place each to the workers, the local community, the environment, the customers, and the supply chain. And when I wrote about it fictionally, added in future generations. And then everyone except the shareholders is going, oh, look, ecocide law. We have to, our point then as a business is not just to make money for the shareholders, it's to honor the local community and the customers and the environment. And then everything becomes different. And that also seemed to me a narrative shifter. And if we could combine the two, that would be completely amazing. So we've got the EU who's brought the concept of ecocide into the legal framework of things that it is creating. We've got Belgium, yay, Belgium, who's doing this. What else, looking down the line, what are you seeing coming towards you that looks hopeful?
So one of the things that's been really we actually didn't necessarily expect, but has been amazing over the last year or so, which we fully expect to continue, is a kind of wave of ecocide bills being proposed into national jurisdictions.
Yeah.
That's happened in Mexico, Italy.
Italy,
Uh,
under
yeah,
Giorgio Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. And Brazil, you know,
Brazil I could
and
see
I mean,
because they've
obviously
now
we
got a
have.
left wing, but Italy's
Well, yes, but I mean, I don't imagine it'll have an easy ride because their Congress is still quite conservative.
okay.
But nonetheless, it's there and it's passed its first hurdle in the environmental committee. And you know, we've seen we saw a bill in the UK. I mean, obviously it fell with the election,
Okay,
but
but
we've seen
it might stand more chance now.
it might stand more chance there. Exactly. I mean, in fact, Labour have historically supported ecocide law, so we'll see how that develops. But you know, and we've also seen proposals in the Netherlands, proposals in um, three, no fewer than three proposals in Peru recently. So, I mean, we're
Mm,
hoping that they'll actually team up between the parties and work out something that they're all happy with. Um, but yeah, so I think we're seeing this interest, you know, coming up not just at regional level, also at national level, and of course, all of that creates a sort of mutually reinforcing
mm.
thing.
If the whole of Latin
Because
America, for instance, decided, because I could imagine Chile, Costa Rica, there's a lot of countries that would, I
yeah,
imagine,
I
even
mean,
Venezuela be on
Chile's
board with
actually
this.
already legislated, not exactly the ecocide, but they recently brought in economic crimes, which have, and there's an environmental element which uses some of the elements from the definition.
Right.
So, you know, it's starting to kind of pop up in all of these different places. And that's really, really encouraging. What we also anticipate is that a formal proposal is likely to be made in the not too distant future at the International Criminal Court. I mean, it's possible even that it could happen this year, but we can't always predict these things because obviously diplomacy isn't a fixed
Hmm.
thing. But that said, you know, it's I think since the developments in Europe, we've seen a shift in the narrative at the international, the sort of global level as well. So instead of being a kind of, yes, this is an interesting conversation and wonder whether it'll happen, it's now much more of a kind of, oh, well, how is this going to happen and when is it going to happen? You know, so that shift has been quite kind of palpable
Mhm.
in those sorts of meetings. So that's been really interesting.
And are
Um,
the Davos
and
crowd, is this a sort of thing that the people who have private jets and fly around the world to tell each other how bad things are they on, because they also tend to have a lot of clout and a lot of money.
Yes, I mean, I think that I mean, we do have I mean, interestingly, we've got some connections into some quite major influencers and at that level. Um, it's by no means embedded in that environment, but but that said, I mean, for example, I actually was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum this year. So I actually was
Wow.
on a public panel at
JoJo.
Davos, which was really interesting. And actually, I think it's quite important that we are there
Mm,
because you know, these people need to know that this is coming,
yeah.
because they need to sort of shift their decision making, their policy making, their future thinking, because of it. I mean, it was an interesting one. I mean, I think we're still a little bit in the situation where you know it is where the ruling elite meet, you know, sort of financial and political, and there is a little bit of a sense. I mean, I kind of felt a little bit like. Um, yeah, I was sort of there to again to do some perhaps do it, have a be a little earthing rod and kind of go, let's just reconnect to what's actually happening on the planet, shall we?
Right. But do you think you were heard, at least somewhere in the room?
Well, it was interesting because one of the trustees of the WF was on the panel with me and was actually a little bit triggered by my use of the word criminal law. And we ended up having a little bit of a sort of sparring match, which didn't bother me at all because it was live streamed. You can probably look it up. I mean, which actually doesn't bother me at all in the sense that it just gave me more opportunity to talk about what we're doing. I mean, it was certainly less fun for the other panelists who got their time hijacked, but at the same time, um, afterwards, in fact, it hasn't quite come through, but, I was contacted by their assistant who said they were interested in having a conversation with me. So, you know, who knows? There are definitely the beginnings of a conversation there. And as I say, I mean, like with this event with the sustainability officers, we're really in a position now where you know, these people actually just need to sit up and pay attention because this is not about, you know, a debate as to whether this is a good idea. It's actually something that's already established. It's already coming down the line. So, you know, there needs to be a sort of sense of, you know, incorporating that into their thinking.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, taking this in a slightly different direction. A friend of the podcast is B. Lorraine Smith, and she used to be the person who wrote the sustainability documents, the ESG documents, for huge international named companies. Until she realized they were paying her quite a lot of money to write 250 pages of basically greenwash. And then she left and she set up something called Materiality, which is suppose fill in big name company was actually doing what it says it's doing to help the planet. What would it actually look like? And in some cases, that is basically it would shut itself down, or it would change its trading model so radically that it would be doing something, it would cease to sell, let's say, for instance, a global, an industrial farming um, chemical that is guaranteed to be poisonous to everything, including the water. It would have to cease to do that, and it would have to, I know, sell fluffy bunnies instead. Um, Not that necessarily fluffy bunnies are a good thing, but it just wouldn't be what it is. In some of the further reaches, because I'm actually writing the novel in my head of the activist lawyer. This law comes in, the National Criminal Court, and it goes, okay, I have my list. I could make the list tomorrow, frankly, of how do I am going to push the boundaries of what's widespread long term damage to the environment, and I am going to take out as many of these as I can. And make them change their business model, because what they're doing is just not compatible with a survivable future. And I would like that to happen, but I'm wondering, have you got the people with real teeth on the edges who are going, just let me at them, we will close them down tomorrow? Is that likely, or am I just fantasizing about happy things that I would like to have?
Put it this way, I mean, there's certainly a lot of lawyers, I think they would be, like I say, looking forward to getting their teeth into this once it's on the books. At the same time, I think what in practice, what would likely happen is that any initial cases would be very clear cut,
Right.
direct pollution cases. Because what lawyers will want
Is
is
easy
for the
wins.
jurisprudence to build up in a clear and usable way.
Right.
So, I mean, for example, we think it's fairly unlikely that the initial cases will be climate cases,
But they might be
because
giant
you're
oil spill cases.
yeah, for example,
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously, what you would have to show is that there was some kind of breach of regulation, or some kind of, it needs to be.
Okay, it doesn't
I
need
mean,
to be
well,
just we
and
took our eye off the ball and somebody forgot to close a hatch and there was a giant oil spill.
yeah, well, but
Okay.
potentially, yes. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, obviously, we tend not to make direct pronouncements because until the law is actually in place, you don't know exactly what text you're dealing with. So most lawyers will shy away from exact examples. But I mean, if you think of something like, I don't know, I mean, a good way of thinking about this is, what are the kinds of things that we could have averted or
Right. If
avoided
this had been in
had this been
place.
in place?
Right.
Exactly. So, I mean, for me, something like Deepwater
That's
Horizon
the
might
one.
well come under
Right.
that, because you've got a safety protocol potentially that wasn't followed.
Right.
And so effectively you do have a situation of, a breach of something that has led to a really serious
And can you do
situation.
retrospective things? Can you say, so, 10 years ago that was a thing? Or you can just say this
No,
would have
no.
been,
I
and
mean,
if you do this again, guys, you're in deep trouble.
yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, if this could work retrospectively, we would never get it in place.
Right.
Nobody
Okay.
would nobody would vote for it,
Okay.
because they would all feel that they might be implicated somewhere around the line. Now, this is the whole reason that we're doing so much work advocating in advance of the law coming into play, because it's yeah, it's really going to be, from this date, you're going to need to worry about this. You're going to need to think about it, or you're going to need to think, positively and
Okay.
constructively about what you're going to do in advance, in order to meet it. And actually, realistically, for the vast majority of businesses, small and medium enterprises, probably not even going to touch most people.
Oh, I
It's
don't
really
know.
going to be, I mean,
Okay, you're
there
probably right, but I'm
there
planning
might be
the
no, I mean, there might be some in very particular sectors
yes.
where that is the case.
Yes.
But, if you wanna stop people on the street, 95 out of 100 probably won't even have to think about it. But it's more to do with, preempting what's coming, so that behavior is different in the future. And don't get me wrong, I completely sympathize with the, I have my short list of CEOs to put in the dock. I mean, I completely get that. And if you'd have talked to me back when I was in the anti-fracking community, I would have given you name by name list.
Keep that
But
list.
we absolutely don't do
Okay.
that. And one of the reasons we don't do that is that, you know, first, like I say, we think of it as a very foundational piece that ultimately will benefit everybody. So we pitch it, we always pitch it positively. But also, there is just the pragmatic political thing of, different states, different players have different affiliations, and we just want to steer clear of all that.
Okay.
They can, all of that is separate from the recognition that damaging the planet to a severe degree simply should be criminal. It's as simple as that. So we don't get tied up or snagged up in particular cases,
Yeah.
in particular
Okay.
companies, you know, for that reason. And I honestly think that's one of the reasons that we've managed to progress this so
Okay. So
fast.
I will abandon all the questions I was about to ask about very specific things. And you're right. I can see that that's a wise way to do it. Although I can also see that in certain sectors, let's go back to fracking. When I had conversations with the person who was our local MP, um, and cited the US, particularly the leak of methane. You know, the fossil fuel companies getting us to worry about methane from cows is it, future generations, if there are any, will look back at that and wonder that any of us swallowed that, because the leak of methane from fracking wells is many orders of magnitude more severe. And I spoke about that to local MP, and he went, "Oh yes, but in Britain we'll have it much more tightly engineered." No, in your fantasies, mate. No, they're lying to you. I'm sorry. I can tell you they're lying to you now. And what they will do is stop you measuring it. Because if you don't see it, it isn't there. And so I wonder now, I have another novel or, I don't know, a dark water equivalent film script running in my head where various people are trying to show, look, there's a lot of methane coming out of these wells. And it's a bit like an airline company that shall remain unnamed, whose aircraft are flying themselves into the ground, and the whistleblowers will end up dead because they're obviously breaching all kinds of safety regulations. But as long as nobody can explicitly say which ones they are, everybody can turn a blind eye because there's a lot of people with a lot of money and they're throwing it all around. So I suppose I get back to the understanding. I read the other day that Elon Musk is giving $47 million a month to the Trust Trump campaign, and he doesn't even notice it's gone. This is petty cash. The people who've got that kind of money to throw around can probably influence quite a lot of people with it. And I mean, this isn't for you specifically. I just wonder, in the long run, we the system needs to change. We need total systemic change. How do we get total systemic change when the people who have a lot invested in maintaining the bus hurtling towards the edge of a cliff because they either don't believe there is a cliff or they think they have the special golden parachute that they will survive with the rocket to Mars or whatever it is. Or I heard the other day they've decided that carbon life is the antecedent to silicon life, so it doesn't matter if we're all extinct because silicon life will take off next. I mean, honestly, but most of Silicon Valley believes this, and they're making the silicon life. It's terrifying.
Mm, yeah.
So given all of that, I suppose I just get to how do
So
we
what hope do we
yes,
have?
exactly. How do we get enough integrity? And I guess it comes down to basic human integrity and people looking their children and their grandchildren in the eye and going, I want you actually to have a livable planet. And I
Yep.
will do whatever it takes to make that. And if we can get a critical mass of those, then
Mhm.
it doesn't really matter how many dollars the other people have. We just, my ultimate end is we just change the currency, because then the people with $1 million or $1 trillion or $10 trillion, if dollars are actually not worth anything and we're all trading in something
Yeah.
else, they have nothing. As far as I can tell, that's the way through. We just have to make it happen.
Well, what I think is really interesting, I mean, it's funny, I just read a book, an excellent book actually, called Democracy in Chains,
Yes,
about,
yes.
woman
I've
called
been
Nancy MacLean, about
begging people to
have you
read
read that?
this.
About this, you know, the beginnings of
What we're
what
seeing
is
now.
we're effectively seeing now. But it's taken many decades to get here, and actually for most of that time, it was too outrageous even for the conservative right.
Yes.
And what I think is, I know this is gonna sound completely bonkers, but I actually came out of that book feeling quite hopeful because
Good. I didn't. Okay, I'm
it
going back to reread it.
no, wait for it. Because if somebody with an idea that is that obnoxious and that psychopathic and that much resisted even by
Mm,
the more what you would think would be the more sympathetic parts of society, and yet still eventually gets there by sheer bloody mindedness and, in their case, funds,
yes.
then surely something like ecocide law, and I think we're already starting to prove this, when you are absolutely specific and determined
Right.
about the thing you want to get, and you have common sense and practically the entire population of the world behind you, how can you possibly fail? So that was my
Okay, yes. Yes, and they moved the Overton window. The people who were saying, you
Yep.
can't do this, it's too far, are now on the left of the Republican Party.
Yes,
And they were
exactly.
then on the extreme right. So
Yes.
they just shifted the dial,
Mhm.
and we can wrestle it back, or we can wrestle a
Yeah,
different
and
dial probably.
And a different, I think, again, I think a different dial in a sense, because I think I actually feel that the whole left right dichotomy is really dying its death, because, I mean, it's that whole thing of, you keep go around far enough, you meet them in the, all of this sort of stuff. But also, I mean, I think again, we mentioned this briefly earlier, but there's so much kind of polarization and controversy and fragmentation in the political space, where, I mean, people, for example, that I used to find that I aligned with on lots of topics, now it's a complete mixture. Some things I align with and other things they're somewhere else completely. And so I just think it's quite hard to just divide the spectrum right and left, as we've kind of done for many decades. And actually, there's sort of there's been such an undermining of trust in all politics, and you end up with in situations where, even if you might, I mean, let's say that Labour in the UK wants to bring in something more radical. There's no way they could have campaigned on that anyway, because it would just wouldn't have, they wouldn't have got the votes. So it's just, yeah, it's really quite a tricky landscape. And that's why I kind of feel like, if we, in a sense, the beacons need to be these really simple truths, be kind, don't destroy the planet, make sure everybody has a roof over their head. It's really basic elements of integrity. And you talked about integrity earlier. And I just feel like this is so, so important. And I know I say it to my daughter when I'm thinking about, who she might go out with. I'm just saying, "Look, just find somebody with integrity and kindness, and the rest, I don't mind."
Yes, yes, because yes, those two things, absolutely, yes. And I
Yeah.
when I think about value systems change from the separation, scarcity, and powerlessness that Mickey Cashtan talks about of our current
Mm.
system, and what do we want the value system that we move to? Almost everybody can get behind integrity and kindness. We might not have absolutely contiguous definitions of what integrity looks like, because we kind of still want to align it with our political stuff, but we can let go of all that.
Yeah.
Integrity is integrity, and you recognize it when you see it. And when
You
someone
really
has
do.
integrity, you can talk to them, and they're not
Yeah.
bouncing around the tribal stuff. I come back to nobody cares who was supporting the Greens and the Blues in the Roman Colosseum, or in the chariot races. But back then, you would die if you were wearing something green and you went into the wrong part of Rome. They would kill you. And it really
Mhm.
mattered which tribe you were in.
Mm.
And now
Mhm.
we have a lot of Roman values that shape our world, but not a single
Mhm.
person knows who is on which side of green and blue, and it does not matter. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, going forward, you're right, left, right, or any of the other tribal factions that we're being pushed into by people who benefit from us
Yes.
spinning our wheels and burning up a lot of bandwidth on being tribal.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Divide and
matter.
rule.
Yeah. Our grandchildren's grandchildren will not give a fuck, frankly. They
You're
just want us to
absolutely
bequeath
right.
them a world that actually,
It's
yeah,
livable.
the survival of complex life is quite an important feature, and the rest just
Think.
isn't. But the people who are deep in it, I spoke at a conference the other day, and I could feel the people who were deeply in certain tribal things getting really cross with me, suggesting that actually they don't really matter. But I
Yeah.
just think they
Like,
don't.
it's really difficult. It is really difficult. And and I think, I mean, it's interesting when I watch my kids growing up, and they have a sophistication of
Mm,
understanding that
mm.
when I was that age
No,
just didn't
absolutely. Yeah.
exist. And there are things that, that I, even until quite recently, found shocking, that my daughter's like, "Oh God, yeah, I hear that stuff all the time. I just ignore it,"
Right.
And
Well
it's like,
done.
in a sense, almost like, just sort of, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there are people that for whom it is, it isn't as easy as that, but she seems to have somehow kind of internalized a kind of her own internal radar. And, and if somebody's just behaving badly, she just, she doesn't get engaged. She just
Right.
kind of goes, "You know what? Let's take your shit somewhere else."
Right.
And I kind of, and I do sort of feel like, even though she's actually not, probably because I am, but she's not, sort of at the forefront of, environmental
Right. Was this
discussion
the
or
same one
politics or
who was
anything like that.
5 and told you that
Exactly.
the
Yeah, but now, I
fracking
mean,
was bad?
I've had moments where she said, "Mum, for goodness sake, I wish I'd never said that, because I never see you now."
Right.
But she's now kind of got past that stage, and she's doing her own thing,
Right.
and she's amazing. But and this isn't the focus of her life. But the fact is that, I sort of feel like, do you know what? They've grown up with
Mm.
this, and actually, it almost feels like it's potentially I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't want this to sort of sound. I'm not quite sure where this sort of places itself because obviously the youth, the young climate activists are actually have been some of the most key players in all of this because they've done this incredible job of raising the alarm. Now, obviously, my daughter hasn't had to do that because she's seen me doing it.
Right.
But it's almost like she now wants to kind of just, you know, get on with responding to whatever the world's going to be when she happens to step into
Right.
it. So she's not sitting there lamenting how many green fields were there 50 years ago that are not there now.
Okay. Right.
And actually, weirdly, I don't see. I mean, it's one of those things that there are different things that motivate different people. I think for example, a lot of the Extinction Rebellion um, sort of following was motivated by, completely understandably, motivated by anger and motivated by grief.
And
For
despair. And
me,
look, I've got
and
something
despair.
I can
Yeah,
actually do. And I've had the last however many decades not knowing what to do. Here's something I can
yeah,
do.
exactly. So actually, but it's like for me, it's different. I mean, in the sense, I'm not saying I'm different to everybody. I'm just saying that the particular way that I approach what I'm doing, it doesn't really come from that. It comes more from. And actually, I've been accused of being an adrenaline junkie for saying this, but it's, I sort of, how many generations get to actually affect the future of their entire
Yes.
species by what they do? And for me, that is incredibly
Yeah.
exciting. It's like, why would that not be the most interesting time to be alive?
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't mean it's the safest by any
No.
means, but at the same time, it's like, wow, I can do something that actually will make a difference because actually we're at one of those
Yes.
points in history where it
Yes. For
can.
every breath you take,
Yeah,
energetically and in the terms of the way you bring yourself in the world makes a difference now. And you know, 10 generations back, it just really didn't. And it
yeah,
really does now.
exactly. And I think so. I do think. I mean, people talk about it all the time. Oh, we're at an unprecedented point and everything. And I think it's probably true. We are at a sort of crossroads and blah blah, all of those sort of cliched terms. But I think for me as well, there's something about. I mean, what I can't get over is how absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I don't know if it's extraordinary because obviously this is the only planet we know that supports life. But here we are, these incredible kind of conscious, intelligent beings, manifest in this extraordinary physical world. And it's like, how is everybody not just kind of going, wow,
Mm.
all the time?
Yeah.
And it's like, people kind of trudging through life as this rat race. And I'm just like, just look in the faces of the people around you. These are all extraordinary beings. And, all you have to do is kind of get somebody to talk about what they feel passionate
Yes.
about. And
Anybody.
you get this kind of
Yeah.
lift out of that kind of lowest common denominator thing into actually a totally different vibration.
Yeah.
And that I think is remarkable. And I think we can, we all have the potential for it. We can all carry it with us into any room we walk into. And so really, I mean, I just think that, all there is to do is do that as much as possible.
It's so, so good. That feels like a really good manifesto to end on. But in case you wanted to say something else, so I will put links to Stop Ecocide International and anything else that I can find on the show notes. But that was wonderful. Also, I'm aware at the time. Is there anything else that you would like to say? Because that was just go out there and be your best.
Yeah,
Find that
absolutely.
enthusiasm, speak it into the
I
world.
mean, in terms of what people can do to support Ecocide Law and what we're
Yep.
doing, I mean, there are always some concrete things. I mean, the most fundamental one is to talk about it. This is all about a conversation. So, everybody has their own networks. And what we usually say is that there are kind of three levels. If you happen to interact with policy, obviously bring it into that sphere. If you have, public interactions, you write articles, you have events, your sector does anything public or puts out reports, see if you can include Ecocide Law into that material. And of course, then there's the private sphere, and that could be your own, that could be your own networks, your own social networks, etc. But it could be, for example, within your sector. Where does your sector talk to itself?
Right.
Where are your annual conferences? What are your newsletters? Those kinds of things where you can bring Ecocide Law into the conversation, and those are the things that just really, really help to move the dial. And of course, if you want the very, more specific things, please go to our website. There's an Act Now menu as long as my arm.
Yeah,
There's
there
something for
is.
everybody. We have lots of different networks, sort of special interest networks, whether that's farming, whether that's business, whether that's oceans, whether that's youth. I mean, really lots of them. And lots of cultural things too. I mean, if you want a bit of inspiration, look up the Choirs for Ecocide Law project, which is just phenomenal. where you can literally download a whole program to teach your community
Oh,
choir with all the rehearsals and all the
yes.
everything. And I went to an extraordinary mega concert in Helsinki Concert Hall at the end of April where they had 1,000 singers singing this program to an audience of like 700 or 800 people. And it was just mind blowing. And that, that spreads the message in a totally different way. And it's just remarkable. The possibilities are endless.
Fantastic. Right. We'll put links to everything that you just mentioned into the show notes, and hopefully everybody will go there and will be inspired to do amazing things. Excellent.
Amazing.
JoJo, thank you for coming on to the Accidental Goals podcast. This has been so inspiring. I would really like in a couple of years, when this has become a law, to come back and talk again. I think that would be really interesting. But I'll just keep an eye on the website. I'll see what's happening, and I'll let everybody know when you get this through. So thank
Oh,
you. Thank you
amazing.
so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here.